Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. My name is Tracy Cook, and I'm the Online Media Manager for modernanalyst.com, the premier community for business analysts. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Understanding Your Supply Chain Process. Today's featured speaker is Jog Rag, Senior Consultant from Sandhills Consultants. Jog has a wealth of 20-plus years experience and has been actively engaged in the enterprise architecture and business process field in a variety of roles and responsibilities. During his many years of time working in EA and BP, he has developed a broad spectrum of knowledge and experience, having previously worked on the development of solutions and methodologies around EA and BP, as well as delivering consultancy and client-facing engagements. Today's webinar will last approximately 60 minutes, including the question and answer session at the end. Please be sure to submit your questions in advance using the questions feature of the GoToWebinar software. And you can also download today's handouts in the handouts section of the GoToWebinar control panel. And Jog, thank you. Welcome.
Thank you for the welcome there, Tracy, and a warm welcome to everybody for our presentation here. And as Tracy was saying, this is a joint presentation where we're going to be presenting some content really about the supply chain. And we're going to be really looking at a number of things in respect to the supply chain. Now, I appreciate the fact that there might be attendees here already know what a supply chain is, but I just wanted to make sure that we all have a common understanding of what a supply chain is. And we'll cover a little bit of that as part of the slides. But the more important areas that we're going to be looking at is how we can use an understanding of our supply chain models, but combine those with our enterprise architecture models. And by the enterprise architecture models, we're referring to the broader sets of architectures that we can create for defining and understanding what the broader enterprise does in its normal day-to-day operations. And then what we really want to get to, and that's the value that I want to show as part of the presentation here today, is to understand the benefits and the value of having the multifaceted and integrated models of your supply chain models plus your enterprise architecture models all put together to explain what the value is of doing that and to understand how we can gain value from examining the supply chain in more detail. So what actually is a supply chain? And you know, in our businesses today, the businesses are really part of a highly complex supply chain involving multiple suppliers and vendors, all located at different geographical places around the world. And if we think about what a typical organization does, it has suppliers that supply goods and services to it. Your organization in its own right will produce output, and then that output is going to be consumed by somebody else down the supply chain. So what we're talking about in a supply chain is a supply chain is actually made up of these nodes or links, and these links represent the individual participants and the activities that are performed as a complete system of organizations, people, and activities. So it's lots of links all put together, where each link represents an organization with its own respective supplier and outputs being provided in there. And the concept of the supply chain is also important, because each link is connected in a specific direction and order. So the supply chain has a particular flow to it, and the flow of that is going to be both the data and the information, as well as the assets which are supplied between the different organizational units in there. And so the supply chain cannot be satisfied, or the delivery cannot be satisfied, unless we transit from each stage in there, in the links, to the final end consumers in there. And the other important thing to consider in here is that when we're looking at each one of the links should really be adding some sort of value to that supply chain, and invariably they are going to be costs and other services and things such as labor and parts and transportation that are all going to be added into that supply chain. So if you think about it, your normal supply chain can be very complex because there can be many numbers of suppliers and consumers which are involved along in that route in there. And so when we're looking at this, let's go back. So the supply chain itself, as I've said, can be very, very complex. And there can be many, many participants and contributors involved in the supply chain itself. And the thing is that every actor and participant who's involved in the supply chain will invariably have a model in their own head as to the part that they are responsible for or involved in. But the problem is that particular supply chain, if you try to examine it and look at it from end to end, unless there is a particular model or some sort of documentation, it is very, very difficult to understand it completely, and very difficult to work with that to make any improvements and have a common understanding of that. So the supply chains are invariably very complex and difficult to understand without having a model in there. And you can use supply chain models to help us to visualize what that process flow is, what the supply chain is, and also to visualize the boundaries and expose the limits of the understanding. And in the past, I've come across instances where people said, I didn't realize we did it like that. Oh, I didn't realize that they were involved in there as well. So it exposes that in a graphical way. But the great thing is, once you have a model of your supply chain, what you can then do is to communicate and share that so that you have a common understanding between the different participants to understand what their processes are that they perform, what responsibilities that they have, and what data actually gets exchanged between the participants in there. And the same process models and supply chain models also get used in detail to help us to understand what issues we've managed to identify, how we can mitigate any risks, and optimize the operations for cost and time efficiencies in there. Now, if you're asking yourselves, well, why am I really interested? There have been a number of incidents over the last few years which have been coming out into the news that you may be aware of. And an example of this is where a number of manufacturing organizations closed down their operations over the summer period, and that led to a shortage of CO2. And the interesting thing there was that exposed the number of different organizations and businesses and manufacturing businesses where CO2 was being used for different purposes in there. There have been other examples of incorrect and improper labeling or supply of incorrect contents for the manufacture of burgers, for example, here, poor logistics for KFC. And then there have been other instances which have been completely outside of the control of the supply chain, but nonetheless have still had an impact on the reputation of the participants who are actually sourcing their content from one of the suppliers in there. So an example of that is the disaster at a textile manufacturing organization in Bangladesh, which occurred some years ago. So understanding your supply chain is very, very important so that we can understand what is going on in there. And so at this point in time, I'm going to hand over to Jeff.
Thank you, Jug. At this point in time, I think it would be interesting to find out just how many of you out there actually understand the end-to-end supply chain in your organization and can communicate it, because we have heard Jug talk about the complexities of it and the importance of it. So let's take 30 seconds out and do a little poll and see just exactly where we fall here. Great, so let's take a look at this. For those of you who answered yes, hopefully the rest of this presentation will help solidify your knowledge and reinforce that you understand what you actually understand. And for those of you that answered no, this presentation will help you get to the point where you have a better understanding, or at least how to approach it, for defining and documenting your supply chain. So with that, I will hand it back to Jog to finish the presentation.
Great. Thank you for that, Jeff. And so that was an interesting output, and it's something which we've thought about in terms of what people actually do to understand their supply chains. And as Jeff was saying, we're going to take a look at some of the results in here, and we'll see how we can help for those people who don't use any form of documentation, how what we're talking about here in this presentation can certainly help you understand your supply chains in there. So if we've got our supply chains and we want to understand those, if we can create a model of those and then go about managing the supply chain in there, what we're talking about for managing it is to make sure that we understand exactly what's going on as part of that supply chain, and to understand all the multi components of the supply chain. That's, the organizers, sorry, the participants in there, the organizations, the processes, the capabilities, etc., to understand that and their active involvement in the supply chain. But not only that, we also need to understand what are the products, what are the services, and what's the information flows that are taking place in between the different participants in the supply chain. And not only the information about the products and service, but also the financial flows. What financial transactions are going to be authorized and take place, and how often do they take place, and when do they take place? What are the triggers that are taking place within there? And as part of understanding what the supply chain models have, there's obviously a complexity within there. And again, as I was saying earlier, is the fact that there can be many participants and suppliers involved in there. And not only that, but also the limits of your knowledge may not be fully exposed. So you might only know about your immediate suppliers. But what about your suppliers' suppliers? Yeah. And what about your suppliers' suppliers? Yeah. Can you understand who they are and what their participation and the degree of risk that is introduced by those third party or tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers in there? So there's an issue of complexity and exposing that complexity and making the supply chain very visible and transparent to see. The other challenge that you also have is where do you actually start? So obviously you can start with your immediate supply chain suppliers, but there is a need to understand, well, what part of the supply chain do you start with? Do you start with the participants in there, or do you start with the processes, the IT systems, etc.? And we'll talk a little bit about that in just a moment in there. And as the poll has just revealed, 33% of people are using some sort of tools in there, but there's a vast majority of that aren't. Well, what tools should you actually be using? Should you be investing in some dedicated tools specifically for the purpose, or can you get away with your standard documentation like Office and Excel and so on in there? The other point also to consider is that when you're looking at your supply chain, this isn't really a one-off exercise where you're just trying to document what the supply chain is. What you should be really doing is using this to drive and develop your supply chain so that it is capable of progressing change and triggering change within the enterprise, so that the supply chain is always available and documented to satisfy the specific needs of the enterprise in there for that specific part of the supply chain that it's trying to satisfy in there. And the other key thing that has come out, and everybody is no doubt aware, is it's all very well to have very good processes and the understanding of the IT systems and so on, but data is the lifeline, it's the bloodline of any processes that are being performed in there. So the quality of the data that you have and the quality of the definitions and the understanding of what that data is very, very important. So we need to be very aware and very clear on what the data is that we are sharing, not just between ourselves, but also with our suppliers. And so that means that the data that we want to exchange and the interfaces that we want to expose and set up in terms of the data that we exchange with our suppliers, we need to be very careful of exactly what we're sharing, when we're sharing it, and how we're sharing that in there. And again, we're going to take a look at that as part of the capabilities for tool supports to provide the understanding for the data in there. Now, what I was talking about earlier is the need to understand our models, and there is what we call the supply chain operations reference model, and this is a framework which is provided, or rather is available. And the idea behind the framework is that it provides a sort of 50, 60, 70% fit for any organization which is involved in supply chain logistics and managing the supply chain. And what it does, it says, okay, there are some standard processes which are taking place for sourcing, for making, for delivering, for returning the products and services that are supplied as part of the supply chain. But then the same set of processes can also be applied to the suppliers and for your suppliers' suppliers as well. And so overall, what you're getting is a quick start which says, here is something which provides a good generic fit for what a supply chain looks like. But the thing is, what you need to be able to do is to take that supply chain model that you've got and add in the extra 20%, which is the differentiator, and that differentiator is your unique selling points. Yeah, they're the unique things that you are introducing within the supply chain that differentiate you within the marketplace, and that's what makes you your value and your financial gains within there. So the supply chain score models are something which you can use as a quick way of being able to get rapidly started to developing your supply chain models. But again, where do you start? So the first thing that you really need to think about is the strategy. And the strategy means that we're looking at the strategic intent. So it's a case of saying, right, for my particular supply chain, well, what makes this unique? Yeah, what's its unique selling points? What's the value? What's the differentiators that we're supplying or making ourselves available in the marketplace? And once you have an understanding of what the strategic intent is and the strategic differentiators for your supply chain, you need to design the supply chain and optimize your processes, the organizations, the IT systems, etc., to deliver on those particular promises that you're making. So you need to design the supply chain and the processes, and that extends to the data and the flows of information and your point of contact with your suppliers as well. And of course, then there's the actual planning and the execution of the supply chain. But once you've got your processes modeled and the supply chain model, you can optimize that for planning loads. So for example, if there are different demands being made, say for example on Thanksgiving Day and Black Friday versus Christmas versus the normal run-of-the-mill through the rest of the year, the same processes can be used for planning. But the actual execution is where we gain the information as a feedback on how well we're performing. That provides the information back to the strategic intent and the design to make sure that we are delivering on the promises that we have made. So there's different levels of modeling that we need to do. And when we are modeling it, what we are going to be looking at is looking at a supply chain life cycle. And what we're talking about here, the first step that you need to do in here is the strategy defines how the network and the systems are going to order in order to be able to compete in the marketplace. And that's the point where you start evaluating the benefits and costs relating to the operation to serve that particular supply chain segment profitably. Yeah. But once we've got that high-level strategy in there, we need to understand what capabilities the business already has and how those business capabilities can deliver on the promises for that particular supply chain in there. And so we need to understand how we can execute the supply chain in there. The next step in here is to capture the business processes and map those back to the capabilities. And that involves identifying all the activities, all the information, and all the resources involved in the supply chain, and creating flowcharts to obtain an overview of the chain and what the flow of raw materials is, and the products, and the position, and the function of the chain of actors in there, and the types of interactions taking place between the actors in there. As I said before, we also need to make sure that the data that we've got is flowing, and that is very important to define what the actual data it is, and the points of intersection for that data between the processes and what data is being shared between who in there. Then we also need to understand who are the participants as part of the processes. And that might actually extend to understanding what the processes are and understanding what data interactions those stakeholders have with the processes. So that might involve in defining the responsibilities, or rather the RACI components, that's the responsibility, accountability, consulted, and information characteristics for those particular stakeholders on the specific processes and the actions and the data that they take place. Now, the same goes with aligning the processes to the external stakeholders. So what we mean by that is, well, what processes are going to be the points at which we're going to share information with our external suppliers? And not just the information, but is there any active participation between the two, between ourselves and them, where we need to work together to deliver and execute the supply chain in there. And then least but not last is really the IT alignment to support the supply chain. Do we have the IT systems in place to enable us to actually go along and deliver to the needs of the organization in there? And if not, we need to be able to understand what needs to happen in order to be able to deliver that. So we were talking about the data flows, and I've mentioned this quite a few times in here. And with any organization, as I said before, you know, the data itself is the lifeline, it's the bloodline of the organization. So we need to make sure that the product and the service flows, which define the flow of information and the assets between the different suppliers and consumers, between the different organizations, is well understood in there. And that includes information flows, you know, about the order and the information about the delivery and who's dealing with what. But not only that, but also the financial flows, you know, when is the payment being made? What are the credit terms? What other financial information? When are the transactions going to be completed? When is payment going to be made? So it's vitally important that we define what data it is, and we share that very well with our partners, and they know what they're expecting and when they're expecting that. So when we're defining our data, the data flow itself, we have to make sure that the metadata definitions are fully defined. So what we mean by that is that when we say this is a product, or this is a service, or this is a thing, we define what that thing is. We define what that metadata is. So everybody's got a clear understanding of that. If we get to the point of where we are exchanging information with our suppliers, obviously there's a number of ways you can do this. You can either have direct integrations, or you can have interfaces, and the interfaces could be email exchanges or telephone contacts. But if we want to have automated IT systems, then we need to be very clear on what data we are supplying and what happens to that data and where it's going, if it's going to be automated in there. And as part of that information exchange, then we need to know, well, what's the data flow? When is this information going to be supplied? What's the content? Who is it going between? Who's it going from and to? Is there any information that we need to understand about the lineage? And what we mean by that is there anything which is going to happen to that data? Does it have to be transformed from one type into another type? So, for example, you know, if we measure in metric, in meters, does it have to be transformed into feet or inches? Are we aggregating volumes and orders? Are we extracting out specific data in there? You know? So we have to be very clear and understand what the lineage is in any exchanges, and what's the format of that data. Is it structured? Is it an automated data exchange? Is it a file? Yeah, or is it, as I say, a fax or an email that's being sent out in there? And on top of all this is the fact that we need to show regulatory compliance. Especially when it's personal data, we have to be cognizant of that when we are exchanging information, especially across geographical boundaries. And I'm sure everybody's aware even more of the need for cybersecurity, especially for global supply chains, where we need to make sure that in the information exchanges that we've got, we have to have a need to make sure that there is good security within there. So in the next section, what we're going to do is, again, we're going to start looking at how we can use a modeling tool to help us understand what the supply chain is, how to get the most out of our data. But just before we do that, we now have the second of our polls, and I'm going to hand over again to Jeff to introduce the second poll.
Thanks, Jog. So before Jog gets into describing, modeling, and visualizing your supply chain, it would be interesting to find out what you all are using to document and visualize your supply chain. So we'll take 30 seconds out here and take a look at these questions and see if we can get an idea of what you're using out there. And so, yes, this poll seems to reflect what is the general consensus out there, that Visio is a very popular tool for visualizing your enterprise, followed by MS Office. It's interesting to see that 10% are using nothing at all. So with that, what we'll do is hand it back over to Jog, and he'll explain some of the techniques, some of the types of diagrams that you could either make in Visio or other products to help visualize that.
That was an interesting result in there, but I think, Jeff, when we were speaking about this earlier, it was what we were expecting it to be.
Yeah,
within that.
Absolutely, absolutely.
It's not a shocking result to us, yeah. Okay, so if there's a good percentage of people that are using Visio, well, what we have found is that I guess that's a start. So using something is better than using nothing at all, yeah. And I'm sure that things like Visio and other tools are capable of handling different types of models in there. But I think the big point about what we're talking about here in terms of having supply chain models, which are again a type of value chain and again are a type of a process flow model, having some understanding of that, but very importantly also having an understanding of the broader enterprise architectural components. And by that what I mean is being able to understand what the business does in terms of the processes, in terms of the data, in terms of the people and the IT systems. Now, one of the things about the modeling capabilities that we're talking about is that you can have each one of those models, but they don't stand in isolation of one another. What we've got is a model which is an integrated set of components. Yeah? And the value of having that is that later on you can start doing what-if analyses. And with Visio, yes, you've got a lot of diagrams, but you can't start analyzing those to see what the interlinkages are between different components in there. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on as we go through the slides. But what I'm showing you here is a view which is talking about the capability model. And what the capability model is doing as part of understanding for the enterprise architecture is to say, well, actually, what is my enterprise capable of doing? What are the what's the functionality it's providing in order to be able to deliver upon the strategic imperatives of the enterprise in there. And what we're able to do with this is independent of the IT systems and who does it and what processes we've got in there. It gives us a way to see, well, actually, here's the capabilities and here's the fitness for purpose. And so we can start asking and performing analyses here. And an example of here is where we've got these sort of heat bars and heat maps on here, where it's assessing the individual capabilities and determining the degree of their fit towards a particular measure that we've got in there. And so we can have these capability models and understand those. And as it says on here, we can make assessments on their capability to deliver to the needs of the business. We can use these as a way to determine any deficiencies we've got or any omissions, gaps in our capabilities to support the particular supply chain model that we've got, and to prioritize the development of the capabilities and also determine and agree the service level agreements that we want in here. So if we've got this capability model, that's something which helps us to understand what the enterprise is able to do, what's it capable of delivering. Now, remember earlier on when we were talking about the supply chain operation reference model, if we take a look at the models that it provides, what it does, it provides a high-level view here, which talks about the planning and the return and the deliver and the make and the sort. And each one of those supply chain steps can be broken down into the individual high-level processes which are going to be performed. And if you look on here, we can see these little plus signs, and what those plus signs do is they say that we can break that process down, and we can break that down to another level, level 2, level 3, level 4, etc. So we get down to a point where we're actually defining the individual steps and activities which are going to be performed as part of the process in there. And again, what this enables us to do is to have a sort of 80% or 70% fit of a standard supply chain model. But again, what you as for your strategic imperatives, for your particular supply chain segmentation models that you've got, for those, you can start adding in the unique processes and the steps and the activities that you're going to perform, which provide the unique selling points and the differentiators for your supply chain. Yeah, and that's the idea here, is to have a quick start for developing your process models in here. And you should be able to identify and analyze any gaps in the processes that you've got in there. So if we take these high-level processes and we decompose those, what we get here is a flowchart type of model. And what the flowchart type of model is doing it's showing in some detail here. Well, here's the starting point that we've got, and we take two paths. We go along this path and we go along on this bottom path. Then we join up here, we perform this step, and then we finally end up with the end result here. And so this is a low-level type of process flow, and we can carry on ad infinitum describing the individual processes that we've got in there. And again, as I say, we can use these as a way of achieving your competitive differentiation, looking at the gaps in there, what inefficiencies have we got, are there any redundancies and opportunities for improvement of the processes? Because what you're doing with these processes is you're defining both what processes you are currently performing if you're looking at your current supply chain, but also adding in new process steps that you might be performing to support any new supply chains that you're looking to deliver to. So when we're talking about the enterprise architect facets, another aspect of that is to look at the organizational view. And what this is doing is it's defining the organizational units, but not only those, but also the individual roles, or rather the actors, and what roles they are performing. And those actors and roles are the participants, and they could be the owners of your processes. And so we can develop an organizational view. But the idea behind having the organizational view is that we can then start looking at that and assigning responsibilities for that. So you might be familiar with things like the matrices, where we can look at the responsibility, accountable, consulted, and informed status of the actor against a particular process. So in this example, we've got a matrix where we've got the individual low-level processes which are being performed. We've got the roles that the various actors are performing in here, and then we've got the status or the racy characteristics for that particular role and the particular processes that we're performing within there. Another dimension that we're interested in looking at is the global sourcing map. So a global sourcing map is essentially what we're talking about here is the location at which your business is being performed. And when I say your business is being performed, the location could be where you're sourcing your components from, where you're sourcing your products and services from, where the distribution centers are, where the headquarters are for the processes, where the locations are for the storage of your databases and your networks and so on. But the reason why we're interested in knowing the geographical locations is that we can start looking at those and trying to understand what potential there is for disruption of a supply chain. So there might be things where we've got our suppliers, and if we understand the potential for natural disasters like floods and hurricanes and so on, well, how's that going to impact our supply chain? If there are any cyber attacks in particular parts of the world, well, how's that going to impact us? Are there any geopolitical factors, that are coming into place that are impacting our supply chain in there? So the location model is not just, the locations of where we're sourcing our components and parts and products and services from, but also the locations where we're conducting our business. And that, as I say, can have a bearing on the performance of the supply chain. Now, the final dimension that we also want to look at is not just the locations, but also what's the IT systems. And the IT systems are what exist to support the processes to help us to deliver to the supply chain and the products it's supposed to be delivering in there. So here we can understand what systems we've got, what databases we've got, and any other IT technical hardware and software that we require to support the needs of the supply chain in there. Now, if we've got a good understanding, therefore, of the capabilities, the processes, the organizational aspects, and the responsibilities, plus what IT systems we've got in the IT systems, it means then that we're actually in a position to be able to start looking at the supply chain and performing analyses on there. So if you've got a good understanding of what the supply chain is, plus all those other facets from the enterprise, it gives us the ability to examine the supply chain. So, well, actually, how well are we set up to execute the supply chain? Are we doing it well, or are we doing it poorly, or what opportunities are there for improving the process flow in there? As part of the supply chain, what's the flow of the materials, the information, and how do we manage the demand in there? And it's only by understanding what the data flows are, what the handoffs are over between the processes, between the suppliers which are involved in that. It's only by understanding that are we in a position to be able to understand what the flow of the process itself is. If we look at the processes, well, are there any processes which we're performing where we're introducing unrequired or unexpected cost in there? Can we see what those costs are, and can we eliminate or reduce those in there? Are there any steps and activities that we're performing where we are not introducing value? Or can we look at the supply chain and say, well, actually, can we improve this? Can we innovate on the supply chain and add additional value in there and additional quality in there? But also, as part of the understanding of the supply chain plus all the other areas, is, well, where is there risk? Can we identify what risk there is? Where is it likely to be introduced? Can we manage that? Can we build in resilience so that we can mitigate the effects of any risk factors that are involved in there? And then finally, we can also look at this, even at, as I was saying, is that your supply chain could be involving third-party, third-tier suppliers, supply chains. they can still have a direct impact on how you are perceived, you know. And if we can understand where our supply chain is and where the source of our materials is, we can demonstrate our good citizenship and our corporate social responsibility by making sure that the suppliers, the ultimate suppliers in here, are being treated fairly and well, yeah? So that we minimize the potential for damage to our reputation in there. So by having these good models integrated with one another, understanding the various aspects of those, it means that we can actually perform impact analyses and dependency analyses where we're looking at the contents that we've got in there. So if we're looking to optimize the processes that are part of the supply chain, so here is an example. Let's say if we're about to change a piece of data, well, how does that impact the processes and the services and the applications that we've got? If we're about to change the location of the performance of the processes, well, what's that going to impact? Again, we can understand that by looking and tracing through the impact and the dependency analysis between the various enterprise architectural components that we have modeled in there. And it's only by having the various aspects in there are we in a position to be able to perform these types of impact analyses and dependency analyses. So, well, you know, why do we want to do this? Well, the idea is that once we've got a good understanding of the supply chain, we can perform the impact analyses. It means we can look at the supply chain and we can manage our customer service expectations. We can respond. Yeah, if the customers are expecting, instead of 1 week delivery, they're expecting a 5-day delivery. Well, that's a change in expectation. How can we optimize the business and the supply chain to deliver that? How well can we manage the costs which are associated with the operation of the supply chain in there? What elements have we got in there where we've introduced any risk? How can we mitigate those risks on them, whether they are in our direct control or not? How can we mitigate those risks in there? How can we work with our suppliers and our partners to understand what the relationships are and to help us to improve the supply chain? How can we innovate in there? And what's the information flow that we've got? And we can communicate that in there. How can we make it better? And then again, you know, all of these are going to impact either financially, commercially, or to the reputation of your enterprise and your business operations in there. So having an effective supply chain management strategy, having your good models, enables you to do that, in the absence of which it is going to be quite hard to be able to do that. So that was what I wanted to present in terms of the presentation and the content in here. And what we're now going to do is we're going to open up the lines so that we can have any questions and answers from the audience in here. So Tracy, I think that is back over to you, and if you can take control and handle this.
Absolutely, Jog, and thank you so much for today's presentation. And as Jog was saying, as a reminder, if you do have questions, please type them into the questions box and I will pose them to Jog and our speakers today. Jog, our first question. It seems like there is an awful lot of effort required to build a detailed understanding of the supply chain. And is it really worth it?
That's a good question. So there's a lot of effort involved. Well, I guess if you don't do it, it's business as usual, and you will be susceptible to the to not having an understanding of what the business itself does. But from our experience and our workings with different organizations that have been involved in these type of activities, any models that help you to understand and improve your understanding of what the processes are, as an absolute minimum, trying to understand what the processes are and understanding what the data is that's involved in there. They have found that it is beneficial and it improves their understanding and their ability to be able to to improve and protect themselves from any outside external factors that might influence and disrupt their supply chain. So our experience has certainly been that having a good understanding certainly helps in there. But it's like with anything else, you know, you've got to put the effort in to get the rewards. And yes, there is some effort, but hopefully the rewards outweigh the effort that's required to put it into there.
Just to add to that, to what Jog said, is if you think about these things as being more or less a blueprint and roadmaps for your organization, there is a certain amount of planning and understanding that goes into creating these things, but the effort is upfront effort, because later on, when things change, you'll be able to see what the impacts are. Now, Jog showed a diagram that he called an impact and lineage analysis diagram. Now, we're able to construct that because we understand what connects to what. So, as Jog said, when things change, and that could be an external change or it could be an internal change, the ability to see what is impacted allows you to quickly make the plans or make the modifications needed to rectify or address a certain thing that you want. Right, so that's really where a lot of the benefit comes in. So a lot of times when I'm doing enterprise architecture projects, I do get the question that, boy, there's a whole lot of effort involved in building these diagrams and managing these diagrams and keeping things up to date. But all it is required is one small change and the ability to know who I need to talk to, what process is affected, what system has to be changed, is a whole lot better than having to go and have meetings and try to figure that out.
Great, thank you for that, Jeff. That's an extra bit of information there. Yep.
Excellent. And we'll move on to our next question. Just a reminder, if you have questions, just type them into the questions box and I'll pose them to Jog and Jeff. Our next question, we have normal business continuity planning and disaster recovery planning. So why do we need to do this as well?
I've had that question asked before, so that's an interesting one again. So the normal sort of disaster recovery and disaster recovery planning, etc., is really concerned and interested in making sure that the business is up and running back to normal. However, that doesn't equate necessarily to the optimization of your business processes and your supply chain. So yeah, you can bring the IT systems back up, you can get everybody back up online, etc. But it doesn't mean that your supply chain is going to work any better. It's just going to work just as poorly as it did before your disaster recovery plans were put into place. So disaster recovery is part of this, but it's not the whole thing. What we're trying to do here is to look at disaster that impacts the supply chain directly, even though your normal IT systems are working perfectly okay. So that's what we're interested in doing, is to make sure that the supply chain itself is resilient to external factors, which may not be under the control directly of your organization directly.
All right, thanks, Jog. This looks to be our last question. And so, Jog, what are the most current reasons why a supply chain flounders or even fails?
What are the most common reasons why a supply chain? Okay. That can be. That's a very broad question. Why a supply chain can fail. So there's two aspects to it. One is obviously, the supply chain hasn't been designed very well and hasn't been resilient. So that's a business commercial question. And if we sort of leave that to one side, I think from our perspective, we're looking at how can we understand what the supply chain is, how can we improve it. So we're looking at it from a point of view of what can we as an IT organization help the business. Then on that case, it's more a case of the external factors that can come into play are going to be things like cybersecurity, IT outages, terrorism, and regulatory changes. Those sort of things are more like what we can handle internally to ourselves, so we can make ourselves more resilient. So again, having an understanding of what the supply chain is and where the processes are likely to fail, because if there's an IT outage at a particular point in time or portion of the supply chain, what can we do about that? Well, how can we mitigate that risk? Yeah, can we put into workplace alternative mechanisms to go around that? That's where you should really be looking at. So outside of the sort of business commercial things, we as the IT people can help to mitigate those risks by looking at the direct supply chain and its operation in there.
Yeah, and to add to that, what Jog said is usually I find that in supply chain, if you think about it, it's a chain, right? One thing connects to another thing, and the weakest link is what usually causes the whole thing to collapse. And where the links are the handoffs. That is, from our external suppliers to our internal processes, from our internal processes to our customers. That's where things can break, and if they do break there, then that is what causes, like a collapse of the supply chain. We have to think about things like, for instance, what if the supplier that we are counting on goes out of business? That's a critical link, and so we need to have some sort of, if you think about business continuity, some backup supplier that can not only deliver the products or services we need, but to deliver them in the volume that we need, right? Same thing with customer, right? We could have a perfect supply chain that says that we deliver a quality product to a customer on time. But if the customer says, well, I don't want it in red, I want it in blue, well, we never considered the fact that somebody might want a different color. So these are the things that you think about and plan for in trying to improve your business processes to go from, let's say, a product-centric kind of approach where we deliver quality products to people, to a customer-centric approach that says, what would my customer want? Would they want it in a different color? Would they want it in a different style? So with sort of understanding the supply chain helps us transition from product-centric approach to a customer-centric approach.
Thank you. We do have another question here. Jog, does Jog recommend any specific modeling or automated BPM tools focused on SCM?
Okay, so I think we'll have to qualify that answer on the question. So we as a company are Sandhill Consultants, and we're presenting, and we partner with Irwin, so we are supporting their particular products in here. So there are certain process modeling and supply chain, certain process modeling and data modeling and information modeling capabilities that Irwin itself has, and so we can certainly use those. And the process modeling capabilities, yes, there's a number of those that Irwin supply, and they can either be on premises or cloud-based. And similarly with the data and the data mappings and defining what the data is in there. If it's a specific supply chain management product, then that is, I'm sure there are plenty out there, but they are not within the scope of what we're covering here today. We are not necessarily supply chain management specialists. What we recognize is that supply chain management is the management of processes and the data. And that's the key important bits that we want to understand in here.
Thank you, Jog. And that looks to be all of our questions today. Jog, just a reminder, you do have a couple of more slides, so I will turn it back over to you.
Excellent, thank you. So, thank you for everybody that contributed those questions on there. That was really good. And just to wrap up here, what we were talking about here, and again, just going back to the poll that we had, there is a percentage of people that are using tools, and there are a certain percentage of people who aren't using tools, and a certain percentage of people who are documenting their systems. The thing is, and this is something which has been quoted by Benjamin Franklin, you know, by failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail. So that might be a little bit strong in the respect that, you know, as a business, as an enterprise, you're still operating and running. But the point that it's making is that if you don't really understand what your supply chain is, if you don't understand what the document, what the links are within the supply chain, and you don't understand who your suppliers and your suppliers are, then you are really exposing yourselves to situations where you might not be able to respond rapidly. Yeah, having a transparent and open and visible supply chain that you understand, and also your immediate participants, you know, the users plus your suppliers understand, means that you are protected to some degree, so that you don't get hit with unexpected disruption to your supply chain, because that's what you're really trying to do, is to build in resilience to your supply chain so that you can respond, or have the supply chain so that it is resilient to respond to the needs of the marketplace in there. And those sorts of disruptions can come from anywhere. You know, it can be competitive market forces. Yeah, so there might be things out there where a new competitor comes online, or a new product comes online. Yeah, as I said, it might be customer expectations. You know, they want 24-hour delivery instead of 1 week delivery in there. There might be natural disasters which happen out there. Well, how does that impact your supply chain? You might not know about those, might not have prepared for those specifically, but if generally you can add resilience into your supply chain, then you're in a better position to be able to continue with delivering as per your supply chain in there. And of course, you know, there can be other factors from sanctioned countries, government shutdowns, Brexit, and so on. And they can all be unexpected disruptions. But if at least we understand what the supply chain is, we're in a better position to be able to respond and be in control of the supply chain. And that means that you need to have a transparent and documented end-to-end supply chain models. So preparation, I think, is the key here. And then finally, as a follow-up, for additional information, there are a number of contacts we've got here. For EMA, you can contact Sandil here. For the North America, there's also the link in there. And then obviously we've got our online access points in there as well. And with that, I'm going to hand over back to Tracy.
Thanks, Jog. And thank you to both you, Jog, and Jeff, for today's excellent presentation. We'd like to thank everyone for attending today's session. And I'd like to remind everyone that today's webinar, along with the slides, will be archived at the modernanalyst.com website within a few business days. And that concludes today's event. Have a great day.